What family secret did you learn that totally shocked you? Not my family. But I thought I'd contribute. Friend turns 15. And she's told she's adopted. Turns out that both her parents died in a car crash when she was just a baby. And her uncle adopted her and raised her. Told her that both parents were dead. A year later, a man messages her on Facebook saying that he's her half-brother. Turns out the dad lived through the car crash and later remarried. Her adopted parents were lying to her as they knew all along. The dad just didn't want to keep her. That's the secret, so to speak. However, the story continues. As her biological father wanted to meet her, she flies out to meet him. Stays with him. Meet his wife and her half-siblings. Struggles with the idea of reconnecting with him. Because she both loathes and loves him. Loathes him for not wanting her and getting a new family. Loves him for wanting to make a difference in her life and reconnect. She takes the plunge anyway. 6 months later he dies from lung cancer. Life's cruel joke on her. My favorite uncle cheated on my auntie. Ended up knocking the woman up. She had the child and my uncle was forced to tell my aunt. Aunt divorced my uncle. He became an alcoholic and I had absolutely no idea. I thought all the times we were going for car rides as a kid. He purposely drove crazy because it was entertaining for me and my cousins, but it turned out he was just plastered. That my mom is actually my grandma. My dad is my step-grandpa. And my sister, who is 13 years older than me, is my mom. And my biological dad was 21 when he got her pregnant. Edit: a lot of y'all are getting more upset about this than I did. I didn't find out until recently. In my 30s. So at this age pretty much nothing shocks you. But it would have shocked me in my teens. When my mother was super religious. Warning us against premarital sex. In my early 20s. She tried to stop my girlfriend and I from living together when we moved to a city where we knew no one. Obviously. We lived together. But we had to hide it from her when she came to visit, when some unmarried friends of mine had a baby unexpectedly. And the child was born with a physical handicap. She even insinuated to me that it was punishment from God for having a baby out of wedlock. So guess what? A few months ago, my aunt mentioned in passing that the reason my parents got married after only knowing each other 4 months was because my mother was pregnant. She ended up miscarrying. Which is why we never figured it out before. That my aunt wasn't born looking like that. When she was younger, some kids in the neighborhood ganged up on her and attacked her with a 2x4. I never knew, and once I found out I just felt so sorry for her. I was never told what happened to the attackers. My father had an affair with his brother's wife, so my cousin is also my brother. My cousin doesn't know though. Grandma let this slip whilst wasted. One is mine. One is my friend's. Mine, Uncle held a man in the old country. Gang fight. Picked up one of those big cigarette garbage things and hit another dude in the head. He did time in jail and was disowned by his family. My mom is the only person to visit him. My friend. He was told his parents died. Turns out his dad is his uncle and the woman who raised him, his aunt, is actually his mom. Edit: old country is Taiwan. Edit 2. It's a smoking can. Thanks. You might need to draw a diagram to understand this one. My dad was born when my grandma was 18 and my grandpa was 14. He never looked like his dad and always thought his mom had an affair. For context, my dad's family is all Lebanese, but he is very fair-skinned. Which was partially why he assumed it had been an affair. When his dad's father, my great-grandfather, was on his deathbed due to cancer, a relative confessed to my dad that his grandfather was actually his father. My dad had my stepmom take hair out of his real father's head and had it sent for DNA testing, which confirmed it. Yeah. Little morbid if you ask me. So basically, my grandma had an affair with a married man when she was 18. Had 1, possibly 2 children with him. Then married his son and had another 4 kids. So my dad's siblings are both his siblings and his niece's nephews. And the man who raised him is actually his brother. Yeah. I don't talk to that side of the family anymore. My great-grandpa died on top of my aunt while raping her when she was 13. Edit, it was my great-aunt. So her dad died while raping her of a heart attack. My grandmother pretended she didn't have a sister for 50 years. Recently reconnected. Great lady. My great-grandfather was a clan member. And he was married 7 times. My dad was a huge pothead and barely graduated HS. Didn't do college. He is now a fire chief for one of the best fire departments in the country. WTF dad. Edit. You guys. I don't care that people smoke pot and don't go to college. It's just uncommon for someone of his rank to not be college educated since it's a pretty big requirement. Found out when I was 22, but apparently I had an older sister. She died very young due to heart defect or something before I was born, but yeah, no one in my very large family ever let it slip the whole time. I only found out because my other 2 older sisters found a letter buried in a closet one day years ago and they told me about it way after the fact. Never asked my parents about it. I can only imagine what kind of old wound that would dig up, and they don't need that. I just quietly visited the grave by myself once to leave a flower. It was a pretty unreal feeling. Edit. Whoa, what the sheet. Didn't expect this to blow up so much. Thanks everyone for your kind words and for sharing your own stories. Certainly not what I expected my highest rated comment to be, lol, but I enjoyed reading all these, so it's alright. My great-grandpa murdered one of his own children. The family was a bunch of poor backwards hicks and having trouble feeding their kids. My great-grandma was pregnant and didn't learn until delivery that she was pregnant with twins. Great-grandpa's solution was to bash one of the baby's heads against the wash basin. My grandpa wrote a letter to my mom on his deathbed, and this was one of the things he wrote about in the letter. When my mom told me, my blood turned to ice water. The sheer evilness completely shocked me. Edit. There's been a few comments showing sympathy for my great-grandpa or even defending his actions. Duck off. This isn't a college bull session where we discuss humanism and philosophize about morality. This is something that actually happened. Crushing an infant's skull because you're afraid you can't feed him is evil, plain and simple. My great-grandfather may have murdered my great-grandmother because he believed that my grandfather was the product of an affair. I don't know whether the affair was true, but I know that on his deathbed he still believed it. His last words to my grandfather were, "I never liked you. Yeah, no? Because you weren't mine." Maybe an inverse sort of deal. But my family were apparently millionaires in the late 1800s. I guess they had always been very wealthy. But between that wealth getting split up every generation and my family living on the run for many generations, all that money was gone by the time I came around. Only thing left was a chunk of property in Mexico that is completely worthless aside from a small bit of money from it cause there's a highway going through it. This totally shocked me because in my lifetime my family has been quite poor. Full on redneck on top of that. And lots of issues with addiction. My aunt with a very holier than thou attitude has been having a 40+ year affair with a childhood sweetheart. This is a person that was always quick to criticize other people's family issues and tried so hard to present her and her family as perfect. Her husband is an asshole to our family and she lets him completely get away with it. I guess we know why now. Not so much a family secret I learned. But when I learned our family secret wasn't so secret at all. Growing up, my grandparents would make popovers for every family gathering. For whatever reason my parents told me that popovers were our family's secret recipe. Or maybe I was just a stupid kid and thought a secret recipe meant nobody else made that food at all. Anyway. Fast forward about 20 years when my wife and I were at a restaurant and they had popovers on the menu. I wondered out loud how this restaurant knew our family's secret recipe. My wife got confused and asked her to explain. Whereupon I immediately realized how dumb I was. She will never let me forget that. My grandma inherited several $100,000 from her stepdad. The juicy part is that to this day, no one knows how he got it. No one even knew he had that kind of money until he died. Since I'm from the south, My guess is rum running or something like that, but we don't know and likely never will. Not mine. But in my wife's family, her great uncle was held by his wife and the hired hand. Poison was assumed as he was just found dead in the field. They were farmers. His wife married the red-headed hired hand, and 8 months after the death she birthed a red-headed son. Everyone in the family in the neighborhood knew except, I guess, the RCMP. This was around 1935 in rural Alberta. That great-grandpa was a decorated soldier who fought in the Indian Regiment of British troops in WW1. In reality, he was a cook who deserted after seeing men sent to attack machine guns with their bodies. Him and a bunch of others noped the duck out of there while stealing a bunch of supplies. This was corroborated by the other deserters that returned with him. Took them a few years to get from France to Vadodara in the current state of Gujarat, India. They sold the gums and rations along the way for money, and great-grandpa picked up an STD from a Iraqi whore. Luckily grandpa was born before he left. They blamed the STD on why he went funny in the head towards his end. Also, the little bit of money he brought back from the stolen and sold army gear helped my grandpa buy some land and kickstart my family fortune so that we could move out of the untouchable class. In my early 20s, I figured out that my oldest sister was abused by my dad a couple of years before I was conceived. This was obviously a big issue to deal with for a couple of reasons. For starters, my dad is just a horrible human being. But I also hold my mom accountable because she stayed with him even though she quickly learned that it had happened. Imagine, if you will, the knowledge that, had your mom done the right thing, you surely would not exist. That's what I live with. Not only should my mom have left my dad the second she found out, but she should have had him arrested. I should not exist. But, to me, the real problem is with my sister. She is now in her mid-40s and, at this point, I'm certain she will never be able to form healthy relationships even with her own family members. My siblings and I are certain she has borderline personality disorder, and might even suffer from narcissism. And we consequently are frequently subjected to the abuse she heaps on us. At this point, we don't put up with it. We want her to get help and choose not to enable her, but our mom is also poorly treated by her, and she refuses to cut ties. I found out very recently that my maiden name, and subsequently rest of my family's name, was supposed to be completely different but was changed by deed poll when my grandfather was 11 by his stepfather. So before my father, we aren't actually related to anyone with this surname. It means nothing to our heritage or whatever. I had always known that my grandmother, while president of her sorority in college, threw a girl's application in the sewer because the girl was grossly overweight and socially awkward. Grandma then lied to the rest of the sorority that the wind blew the application into the sewer. Only recently did I learn that the girl whose application she lost was Linda Bird Johnson, the daughter of the President of the United States. I was adopted by the man I always knew as Dad. I was always asked, did you think of him differently after you found out? My response has and always will be yes. I respect him a hell of a lot more than I ever did before. That my grandmother didn't get a bad neck back from poor posture. Grandfather beat her for spending his savings while away working out of town. She turned into a cripple over the course of 30 years and committed suicide last February. Grandfather has been heavily depressed witnessing it all unfold. My grandmother as I knew her was a hyper-religious Christian woman that had every bit of conservative 1950s social viewpoints. She was racist, sexist, etc. Found out she was pimped out at 16. Got pregnant by the pimp. She didn't want the kids as her father would kill her as they were mixed race. So the pimp took custody and moved to a different state. She was the door kicker in a motorcycle gang. Her brother killed a guy and is serving life in prison. She was part of the same gang. My uncle being a mayor dare her wasn't a shock as he's been in prison since before I was born and I had visited him when I was young. That my great-grandpa cheated on my great-grandma with a neighbor and she ended up getting pregnant. The affair didn't end until my great-grandma, who had no education, Driver's license or job left with my grandma and her brother. She went back and he continued to be an abusive, cheating asshole until he died when I was 7. Grandma lived for another 15 years and said those years were the best years of her life because she was free. Edit, added a word. I'll submit 1 BC. I think it's totally nuts. But it wasn't my family's secret. Family that I've known my whole life lived across the street. The daughter of the family married a cousin of mine. etc. Learned just a couple years ago that the dad of the family didn't go away to the Peace Corps for those years. He was gone in the 80s when we were kids. He was in prison for trying to rob a bank. BC. The family hit such hard times when their second kid was born. The dad is the sweetest person ever and we never doubted for a second that he would do something like join the Peace Corps, that kind of guy. But the prison thing was a real WTF moment for everyone. My dad is a straight man. Everyone in the family assumed he fell somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, but he had to marry mom for appearance sake back in the 60s. We were wrong. No transparent shenanigans for us. He fooled around on mom with another woman. My parents were separated for a year before I was born. My dad had cheated on my mom and she kicked him out to get counseling. He did. And without ever divorcing. Was counseled. Got therapy and came back and apologized to my mom. He had been dealing with some childhood trauma when it happened. And immediately regretted his actions. Edit, to clarify. It wasn't the year before I was born. But 1 year before I was born. By the time I was born my parents had been married 10 years. This happened early in their marriage. My grandfather had supposedly fought in WWII. Never talked much about it. Though. After he died. One of our relatives inquired about death benefits. Well. It turns out you don't get any benefits if you strike an officer in basic training and go AWOL. They never really looked for him cause they likely knew he was under 18. Technically. None of us were really all that shocked. Ages ago I arranged a meeting with the local dope dealer through a real half-as friend and surprise surprise it was my dad. Needless to say major questions were asked on both sides. My god, the look on our faces must have been priceless. My brother was abused by our 35-year-old babysitter when he was 12 or 13. The woman was a close friend of the family and was eventually found out. She was instantly exiled. Side note, one day while she was babysitting I wanted to walk to a friend's house down the road. She really didn't want me to go and kept begging me to hang out with her. I was creeped out by the way she was acting. Could not have left fast enough. I couldn't understand her body language and demeanor at first, being only 9 years of age. Some years later I realized this sick duck was actually coming onto a 9-year-old. Duck in Pamela. I recently learned that my father had an older brother named Michael who died just after my mother and father met. My father never spoke about him and my grandfather, who had started a massive manufacturing company in Sweden, became a different person. You see, Michael suffered from schizophrenia and was a diabetic. A few weeks before his death he went missing and nobody knew where he went except my grandfather, who had a hunch that he was up in their summer cabin in northern Sweden. Because it was their special place where they would go in the summers when Michael was young. My grandfather went up there only to find the door wide open and the master bedroom locked. He busted the door open and found his dead son. Ever since everyone says he's been completely different and that he spent most of his time in the cabin where Michael died. And I learned all of this because in his will he left me all his fortune and a letter explaining why. Every male in my family has murdered someone and ended up being murdered. My dad murdered my mom and was bullied to death, suicide, in prison. My grandfather. My dad's side called a hit on my grandparents on my mom's side and they died in Italy before they could come to America. My grandfather got murdered by the mafia a few years back. My grandfather's parents were friends with Charles Manson and murdered for him. But fled the country to Mexico in 1970, so they were never convicted. They were murdered in Mexico. And from then on it is just a string of mafia relations. My family has had connections from Babyface Nelson to Al Capone. I am male and have not held anyone. I can't even mistakenly step on a snail without crying. 1. My father killed a guy when he was younger. I still don't know why. 2. My aunt was adopted by my grandmother. Or at least that was what she thought. 30 years later it was discovered that my grandfather was in fact her father. Had her out of the wedding with some prostitute who left the kid with him. So he convinced my grandmother to adopt the baby that was found at the hospital. My grandmother died without knowing the truth about it. Sorry for my terrible English. Maybe not me as much. But I got really into my ancestry. Especially focusing on my grandpa because he straight up disappeared in odd circumstances after he got really sick when he was working for the Navy and there was no documentation. Anyway. I get way into it. And someone was looking for him too. Compared details and it was 100% my grandpa's daughter looking for him too. She had gone through foster care but learned details about her dad. And was searching for her family. It was really weird going to my dad and telling him he had a sister. We still aren't sure why they gave her up. But she was born almost exactly when my grandfather died and my grandma remarried. So we think that had something to do with the decision. Still so many unanswered questions. But we still talk and do our best to research. Maybe we'll find more answers sometime. My great-grandfather was a horrible gambler. He was always losing money. In order to pay it back he lent out his daughters. He had 5 of them. They would do wife duties for the men who he owed money. It could be anything from making dinner, cleaning the house or having sex. I don't know for sure when it started but it ended when my grandmother was 8 and she was the youngest. The oldest was 17.